Some believe Ponzi schemes are doomed to fail, but with a sophisticated schemer and a broad enough base of people, they might just be able to keep it going. In honor of Charles Ponzi's birthday, we talk about the history of the Ponzi scheme and some amazing stories of how they've been exposed and ways to see them coming. Today's guest is Steve Weisman. Steve is a nationally recognized expert in scams and identity theft, as well as a lawyer, college professor, and prolific author. His informative speeches, articles, and books make difficult subjects not only understandable, but enjoyable with the humor he brings to these complex issues. Steve is passionate about educating people through his website, scamicide.com. I'm your host, Chris Parker, and this is the Easy Prey Podcast. Steve, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey Podcast again.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
So I know that you are passionate about helping people not becoming victims to scams. And we didn't talk about it last time, but what was that watershed moment? What was that moment where you said, I want to do something about this?
You know, there were really two of them. One goes back to my youth when my father was a victim of a Ponzi scam. And I had no idea what that was like. And he lost some significant money. And my father was a pretty astute businessman. And I was astonished by the people with whom he was dealing. They seemed like the most honest, regular people. You know, it wasn't something shady, wasn't even something particularly greedy. And that intrigued me. And then the second was even closer to home, I became a victim of identity theft. And I started to look into not just how it affected me, but how that works, how serious it is, how pervasive it is. So it's a family connection, and they're also great stories. My God, there's great stories.
Yes, there are some amazing stories. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So this episode, we're recording it before March 3rd, but March 3rd is Charles Ponzi's birthday. And he's often referred to as the one who, Ponzi schemes were named after. So how did all that come into play? What's his story?
Yeah, his story is pretty good. It was, just after World War I, and Ponzi was working in Boston, and he came up with a scheme where he was taking advantage of, he was leveraging currency rates for these stamps that were used in international transactions between the United States and Italy in particular. It's a little bit hard for me to explain, and that's the key to it, because what happens with so many Ponzi schemes is they sort of sound legitimate, but in fact they're not. And there's a Yiddish term called chutzpah or gall. And Bernie Madoff really was the ultimate Ponzi schemer and the ultimate chutzpah gall. And of course, one of the definitions for chutzpah was the boy who murders his mother, murders his father, and then asks for mercy from the court because he's an orphan. So in the case of Madoff actually, in an interview, I actually heard him say this. He blamed his victims. He said it was their own fault. And if they had actually looked into what he said he was doing, they would have seen it was impossible. And that's kind of a theme that we see a lot. You have something that appears to be legitimate, but it may be a little bit more complicated than the average person can understand. However, people are making money. It's been going on for a while, so it must be legitimate. He looks legitimate. And that's what Ponzi was doing. So he took this very simple scheme. I'm smarter than everybody else. I'm going to leverage the differences in the currency rates. And he promised, I think 90% returns in 45 days. It was ridiculous.
Wow.
Really good. That actually contrasts with Bernie Madoff. Madoff, out of all of the Ponzi schemers that I've studied, he promised the least. But what was interesting was he never lost. Never had a losing month. He had continual upswings and always profitable. But Ponzi was the one he was, and the typical Ponzi scheme. He takes in money. he doesn't invest it, but he pays off the older investors with the money from the newer investors. And so this is how the thing goes on and on. And, very often it's, it seems like they should inevitably fail. And in fact, what happened with Madoff was it wasn't a problem with his scheme that caused him to get caught. It was that his was in 2008. People needed their money. And so they started asking for it back. And he didn't have that. And I've seen that before. There's some kind of precipitating event where people need their money back. Now, with Ponzi, what was interesting, and there have been other instances of this as well, law enforcement didn't bring him down. The media did. You did. Reporters did. And there was a Boston newspaper. Ponzi obviously was not cooperating with this investigative story, but they were able to figure out how many clients he had. And they realized that with the number of clients he had to have more of these international stamps than existed in the world. And so it was definitely a scam. And then it was always, which brings me to a chuckle, when he was arrested, I'm innocent. I look forward to my day in court where I can explain all of this. I'm surprised he didn't run because he did go to court. He was convicted. He did his time. He was then kicked out of the country and sent back to Italy, where, Ponzi certainly, how do we put it? I used to work with a talk show host in Boston who said someone would have testicular fortitude. Well, he had particular testicular fortitude because he scammed Benito Mussolini.
Ooh.
Not a good thing to do. However, he was a little bit smarter than he was in Boston, and this time he got out of the country before he got killed. But the thing with Ponzi's scheme is it's marvelous in its simplicity. And that's the thing. It has been repeated time and time again. It preys on the greed of people. It preys on our often laziness of not willing to do the homework. It preys on trusting people in whom we should not have trust. And time and time again, Ponzi schemes have been successful. They are successful now. They're out there. There are some, I'm sure there are many that we're not even aware of yet, but we will become aware.
I'm sure. So let's go back to Ponzi. So was he the first Ponzi scheme, or is this kind of a scam that's been around for thousands of years? Were they doing it with, salt back in the, 400 AD?
They probably were, but I'm really glad you asked that, Chris, because in my white-collar crime class that I teach at Bentley University, I talk about the sexism here, because in my research, the real founder of the modern Ponzi scheme was also in Boston, something about my town, I guess, that in 1870, and it was a woman named Sarah Howe. Now, what was fascinating about her was she found a special niche. Now, it's the 1870s. Women are hardly even allowed to own property. They're not considered to be sophisticated financially. So Sarah Howe opened what she called the Women's Only Bank. Only women could deposit there. She, again, was promising an outrageous rate of return. Hers wasn't quite Ponzi-ish, but she's going about 8% a month. Fantastic. However, she would tell her depositors that they couldn't withdraw their money whenever they wanted because she was going to act as their kind of fiduciary and help them and be responsible for them. Of course, there were no investments. She wasn't doing anything with the money except spending it. Once again, it was the media that was able to, in that case, the newspaper, do an investigation, found out there was no money, no bank accounts, nothing there. And in turn, she went to prison. She became rehabilitated. Well, maybe not. Immediately upon coming out, she did the exact same scam. She opened up another bank, and she managed to persuade women to invest in her, which is another key that we see in a lot of scams, and particularly Ponzi scams, what we call affinity fraud. We trust people who are like us. Now, who is like us? Well, that depends on what that identity is going to be. So, for instance, there was a modern day Ponzi schemer, again in Boston, a guy named Brad Blight, and he had an investment company. And he was also a member of the Masons, and he represented a large number of not just individual Masons, but Mason chapters. And when he got caught, suddenly all of the thing toppled, people lost their money. And I remember talking to some of his victims, and the biggest thing was, how could a Mason take advantage of us? And it was the same thing with Sarah Howe. Women trusted another woman. With Bernie Madoff, he was sort of an equal opportunity scammer. He took in a lot of people, but he very much focused on Jewish people because he was Jewish. And again, a Jew would not cheat another Jew. Well, guess what? Bernie Madoff certainly did. And so the patterns keep on repeating themselves. And it's kind of interesting. There's that precipitating event with Brad Blight in Boston. He was taking in new money, but then one of his major investors, which was a church, had to return, it's kind of ironic, had to return a huge donation they had, a multi-million-dollar donation, to a scammer who had gotten in trouble with the IRS, and he needed to pay off the IRS. So the church agreed to give him back his money, but there was no money because the scammer had already taken it.
Oh, gee. So one scammer wanted money back from a different scammer.
Exactly.
Oh, gee. So what other names, because I think these kind of things kind of ebb and flow over time. Are there other schemes that basically operate the same as a Ponzi scheme but go by other names?
They pretty much will use it. As a matter of fact, the Ponzi scheme will be used for a wide variety. But the essence is that people are investing. They think they have a legitimate investment, and sometimes it isn't as totally clean like with Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff, one of the interesting things, and here is where it's shame on the SEC. There was another investment guru, a guy named Markopoulos, who was asked by the company he was with to look into what Bernie Madoff is doing, try and figure out what he's doing, and we're going to do the same thing. And he said it only took him a few minutes to realize what Bernie Madoff said he was doing was impossible. But then he had to find out how it worked. But when he looked into the amount of money that was coming in, and what the investments would have to be, the key thing for him was, Markopoulos was, he said, I went to every brokerage house in the country and said, any of you handle any trades for Bernie Madoff? And the answer was no, not a single company did trades for Madoff. So money was coming in and no money was being invested. Markopoulos reported this to the SEC about 3 times. And each time they did their whatever investigation, never came up with anything. And, here's a problem with Bernie Madoff. Part of it was he had a stellar reputation. He had been the president of NASDAQ at one point in time. So the SEC has not done generally a good job at finding these out. But not to just pick on the SEC, law enforcement hasn't either. Quite often what you find is the Ponzi scheme only becomes uncovered when there's a major problem or, frankly, the media looking into some wizard guru. But this has even happened in countries. Romania suffered a major Ponzi scheme that took down much of the country's economy. So it works. It's simple, which is always helpful. It's easy to cover up. One of the things, and a key thing for most of your listeners, is when you deal with any kind of investment, you want to check out 2 things. The first thing you want to check out is the person you're dealing with. And so you want to investigate them. And in many of these Ponzi scams, these are people who have been criminals and don't have the proper credentials. With Bernie Madoff, that wouldn't have worked. He did look good on paper. And then you want to understand the investment in which you're investing. And that's something, important as well. If you don't understand it, you shouldn't be investing, in it. When you look at some of the Warren Buffett, for a long time, didn't invest in tech. How can you not invest in tech? He wasn't comfortable. He didn't understand it. But here's the key thing that you find that a lot of people don't recognize when it comes with dealing with Ponzi schemers as an investment. People like Madoff, people like Brad Blight, what they would do is they would be your investment advisor, and they would also be the custodian, the person who is holding the investment. Now, most of the time, what you want to do is you want to have your investment advisor, but you want a separate custodian, a separate broker dealer, someone who is also going to be checking in on this. And in the case of Madoff, in the case of Brad Blight, by being both, all they had to do was falsify the records. They're only lying to themselves, and the victims were fooled.
It's by having the two entities involved, it kind of allows for a little bit of checks and balances.
Exactly. And we have seen instances where there have been initially people who may have been Ponzi schemers, who might have been brokers for Merrill Lynch and legitimate companies. But the Merrill Lynches will catch up with these guys. And that's where you also have that big company backing up that individual schemer.
So do you believe that most of these started as a scam, or was there some legitimate investment that, was happening, and then they weren't getting the returns that they were wanting to get from it, and so it kind of I just need to backfill for a little bit of time, kind of the gambler who's just let me borrow a little bit of money, let me gamble and win my winnings back, and then I'll get back on track. Is it that sort of thing, or did these things start out as scams from the very beginning?
Chris, I got to give you a little credit here. I've done a lot of interviews about Ponzi schemes and scams, and no one has ever asked that question. And it is actually the best question of all.
Well, thank you.
It really is, because Brad Blight, for instance, as an example, he was someone that I knew intimately. I had worked with his company, and we had actually become friends. I was shocked when he went down. And with him, and I don't think it was different from others, and in my research, I've seen it with others, it's exactly as you said. They don't start out, many of them. Now, many of them, Ponzi was Ponzi from the start. There was never anything legitimate there. Sarah Howe was fake from the start. But some of the more, the better looking Ponzi schemers, maybe they looked better because they didn't start out that way. And Blight didn't either. But what happened was some things aren't quite working out the way you want. And maybe I'll do it for a little while. And I always intend to put it back and put the money back. But it snowballs. And then it's a combination of you're in too deep. What do? Do you admit it and take the hit, or do you keep trying to figure out a way along the way? And I would say there's no figures on it. There've been no studies on it, but a significant number of Ponzi schemers don't start out that way. They just kind of fall into it, and then they're too afraid to own up to what happened.
Yeah, I figured that would, that's kind of the human nature of I told the person I had this great investment, and I don't want to look bad, and I'm sure I've got the process right. I've got the system down. It just didn't work in this one scenario, and if we just keep doing it long enough, I just need a little bit more money and it'll work out.
Exactly. A little bit more money, a little bit more time. And what that does is it, first of all, shows how easy it is to do it. Gee, it's still working. And now I'm in too deep. You keep getting deeper and deeper instead of you're using that shovel not to fill in the hole, but to dig a deeper hole.
I mean, is some of it that it just doesn't get caught because, if I have some money and I've invested it and I'm getting the returns that I think that I'm going to get, then let me put more money in there, or I don't worry about it. Like we said, there's the precipitating event of I need my money back. And that kind of reveals that it's a scam. But along the way, if the instrument is performing as you would expect, how would you even know?
Exactly. And, that's the thing. There are a lot of people, and I think they're being somewhat naive, that who will say there is always that a Ponzi scheme is inevitably going to fall apart with some kind of a precipitating event. But quite frankly, I don't think so. And take Bernie Madoff as an example. Bernie Madoff could well have taken this forever if there hadn't been the total unprecedented meltdown that we had in 2008. That's what did him in. And in fact, he was so big. On the one hand, it showed how much money he had stolen and people had lost. On the other hand, it showed you with so many people, unless everybody is going to be asking for their money at once, he's going to be able to take in more money and keep it going. So the argument that it's doomed to failure, I think, is naive. I think that, in fact, if you are a sophisticated enough schemer, you have a broad enough base, you keep it going, you're going to be able to keep it going. I mean, there have been some that have argued that some of the bubbles we've seen in the stock market are just legal Ponzi schemes, and people are buying in without any kind of a reason, and then ultimately someone comes to their sense and boom, calls it in. But I think it's just part of human nature.
And some people will say Social Security, the U.S., is a Ponzi scheme.
There are some that say.
So how big was Madoff's scheme? How much money money disappeared?
Yeah, and it's a fascinating thing about that, because there's what disappeared and what didn't. And so I believe it may have even been as high as $67 billion. Wow. I mean, it was a ridiculous amount. But what's interesting here is, so Madoff goes down, and Madoff, we have to remember, no one caught Madoff. There were no investigative reporters, and certainly not the SEC. Madoff, when you're getting run out of town on a rail, get in front and make it look like you're leading the parade. He knew he was about to get caught, so he turned himself in. And when they went looking for it, where'd the money go? And I mean, billions, they couldn't find any. And so this was, was he hiding it? Didn't appear. The money just got dissipated. But now that's when it gets interesting, because that's when, in the case of Bernie Madoff, we heard about so many people's lives that were ruined because of the fact that they lost everything. They invested with him, and friends got friends to invest with him. But in fact, the trustee in bankruptcy, when Madoff goes down, now you have a trustee in bankruptcy appointed to take over his company and find money to get back to the creditors. And the creditors in this case were all of the victims. So the trustee in bankruptcy was a guy named Irving Picard. Fantastic job he did. And in fact, over the years, since Madoff's debacle and he went down, the victims have been paid somewhere close to between 90 and 100% of their investment they lost. Now, they didn't make any money. And if you put money with him for years, you didn't get even the passbook interest you would have gotten. But they didn't lose their principal. And so it was gotten back in a number of fashions. One of the things you sometimes hear is called a clawback, because remember, some of those earlier investors were paid, but that's fruits of the crime. So Picard went after those people and got the money back. So that's a chunk. He also went after, and I mean, Madoff just exposed how fraudulent some of the legal investors are. There were major investment groups and hedge funds that their clients were paying a lot of money for their advice. What was their advice? Without even looking into it, they turned over the money to Madoff, and Madoff gave them a commission, and everybody looked good, except for the fact that they weren't doing their job. And so here again, Picard went after those investment advisors, and he got money from them. He went after banks with which Madoff did business, who also had breached fiduciary duties, and he got back money from them. And ultimately, he was able to return pretty much everything that the victims had lost. Now, that's unusual. Most of the time, the money, and the thing is, Ponzi schemers are often not as large as Madoffs were. And there are people that are losing perhaps life savings to particular investment brokers who are running this. And most often the money's dissipated. It does seem that you've got that high lifestyle by the Ponzi schemers. And to a certain extent, it exemplifies their greed. To the other extent, it is how they want to appear. And this goes back to Charles Ponzi. Ponzi made a concerted effort to look like he was living high off the hog as you can, because he wanted to appear to be so successful. And that is it. You've got perhaps greedy Ponzi schemers, but they also want to look like they're extremely successful. And so they're dissipating the funds that they get.
So when it came to like Madoff, was he living this absolutely crazy lifestyle?
Pretty much. Madoff had the incredible penthouse in New York. He had the mansion in Florida. He did live the lifestyle of the rich and famous. So he was a good indication of that.
I guess, not to downplay what he did, but he could only spend so much money, I suppose. That, that if, over the course of this $60 billion scam, if he spent $600 million, that would be pretty hard to do. And that's, less than 1%, that's 1% of the total scam.
Yeah, Chris, you're echoing my thoughts all along on this. And that was, to me, one of the most fascinating things, because there's got to be money somewhere. Where is it salted away? And certainly Picard did a terrific job, and I'm sure he went looking for it, and I'm sure he had the same mindset that you and I have, but was never able to find it. So I don't know where it went, but I would say, as weird as it sounds, I'm fairly confident that the assets were dissipated somehow.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's more evident when you have, let's say, a smaller scale scam where there's $10 million invested. Someone can burn through 9 of that $10 million very quickly if they, buy a few houses and a few boats and live a lavish lifestyle. You can go through that pretty quick.
Yeah, and you do have, you'll often have people that the Ponzi schemers may have their own personal issues like gambling, where they can lose money. Their lifestyles are such that, they are the risk takers, and those risks often cost them money. But unfortunately, it's other people's money that it's costing.
Yeah. It's funny that you talk about like the appearance, like this guy looks successful, so that's what draws clients to him. You wouldn't want to go with hey, I've got this great investment scam. Let's, jump in my, 40-year-old Pinto and go to my office in a strip mall and we'll talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. And you look at some of the more famous ones. There was a lawyer in Florida, and his Ponzi scheme was when people settle significant personal injury cases. In some situations, what they will do is they will get paid off over time. It's sort of like, winning the lottery. When you win the lottery, you don't get the $100 million all at once. You get an annuity for that period. So what this lawyer did was he said he was settling these major cases, and he would get money invested from people who wanted to invest in those settlements. In other words, you pay and you're going to get the annuity payments for whatever. So he did this. He was very successful in doing that. The only problem was there weren't any settlements. He was just taking in the money and giving out small amounts over a great period of time. And he came to mind when you were talking about it, because he was a fixture of the high life in southern Florida. He was hanging out with Dan Marino and members of the Miami Dolphins. There were pictures of him with every politician. There are pictures of him, and actually I remember seeing a video of him with not not then President Trump, with Donald Trump and Trump saying, this is a man who's going to be president someday. You can trust this guy. And he ran in the fast lane. Everybody is trusting him. He seems to be living the high life, seems to be doing well. And no one, recognizes that the emperor doesn't have any clothes on.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. Are there other schemes that kind of present themselves as kind of low-level Ponzi schemes and like much smaller scale under different names?
Yeah, there was, and here again is, Alan Stanford was a Texas scammer. He was a Texas scammer, but what he did was he had a bank that he owned in the Caribbean, and it was nice and simple. He was giving out or was selling annuities and CDs at high rates, but not crazy high rates. And so here again, he's more like Madoff rather than Ponzi. Okay, he's giving me a really good rate, and it's guaranteed. It's not so high that I think it's a scam. But it was all a scam. He was able to operate it in the Caribbean, where the regulations for banking weren't quite as significant as they are here in the United States. He was another one. This is all just a horrible, horrible mistake and a slander, against me. He now lives in prison in Texas because eventually, he got caught on this. And once again, there's some kind of precipitating event where a number of people go for their money and they can't get it.
So how is it that, the SEC or regulatory bodies are not the first to find it, and that it's, the investigative reporting in the news and the media that's finding these scams?
Yeah, that's been something that's been very troublesome to me, too, because, as I said, the history, when you look at the regulatory organizations, and primarily you're going to be when it comes to Ponzi schemes, when you're dealing with securities and investments, you're dealing with the SEC. When you're dealing with other types of investments that aren't securities, maybe real estate or something, and there are a lot of real estate Ponzi deals. There was a big one in the country of Belize. It's the Federal Trade Commission. And unfortunately, they're a bit overworked, underpaid, and the investigations aren't that good. I mean, if a good Ponzi schemer will know what kind of documentation to give to these investigators. They're not good at investigating. They're good at looking at paper, and they're not looking for the problems. They look for the problems after they've been identified. Mm-hmm. And it is a real problem. And, we have the regulations, but we just don't seem to have the sophisticated manpower and woman power to investigate these properly.
So if someone thinks that they've invested in a Ponzi scheme, what should they do? Get their money out as quickly as possible? Yeah. Well,
you get your money out as quickly as possible, but don't figure that you're going to be able to keep that money, because if you got money out, it may be clawed back later. And that does happen in a significant number of times. First of all, you do want to take those steps initially, investigate thoroughly the person who is doing the operating the investment scheme and the scheme itself, and make sure you understand it. Make sure there are the safeties in there, like a separate custodian. Anytime you're having the same person advise you and do the investing and also hold and control all the record keeping, it's a recipe for disaster. So you don't want that. And it's easy for that person to falsify records. Madoff did it for years. Brad Blight did it for years. Alan Stanford did it for years. This is something they can do. If you do have a concern, the sooner you can report it. And here's where you do want to report it to the SEC. You do want to report it to the Federal Trade Commission, the better. And the hard fact, or not as hard fact, is that most Ponzi schemers are not as large or as sophisticated as a Bernie Madoff or as an Alan Sanford. So there is a chance that if the investigators get in there early enough, you might be able to get some or, well, it's rare with Madoff, get at least more of your money back.
And so just should, not that I want to be providing financial investment advice, and that's, I'm clearly not a financial advisor. Is part of this like anytime that you're sinking all of your money into one instrument, something that you should be worried about?
Yeah, I mean, this is the, all the eggs in one basket is not a good investment, even if it's a good investment, because investing is serious stuff, and the markets will go up and down, and that's why diversification as much as possible is helpful, because generally it's like if you're going to invest in stocks and bonds. Bonds do not do as well when stocks are doing well, and vice versa. So if you want to be a bit more secure, sleep well at night, you don't get so aggressive. I also, and this is where, is it a scam? What we saw recently with the video game store, Gamestop. One of the things that was being investigated, is this a scam? And the thing is, there is a scam that it seemed like, but wasn't. And they call
it appears like a pump and dump.
That's exactly it. It appeared to be a pump and dump, which it wasn't. Now, in a pump and dump, the bad guys, what they do is they buy up stock in generally a small cap company where they can move the price quite readily. You're not going to pump and dump with General Motors. And then that inflates, they get more people to buy that company. It drives up the stock, and then the bad guys cash out, leave, the truth comes out, and boom, it crashes. And one of the more interesting pump and dumps was years ago, I got a call after a major data breach at JP Morgan Chase. And what really got me wondering was the information they stole, not social security numbers, not access to bank accounts, names and email addresses of high wealthy investors. So I'm going, well, what's this? And they go, I said, without knowing where it was going to go, these people are going to be contacted with phishing and spear phishing emails about investments. Well, sure enough, and we say the East and West can't work together. So there were Ukrainian computer hackers working with American stockbrokers. The Ukrainian hackers got these names and email addresses for the American stockbrokers. The American stockbrokers perpetrated the pump and dump, where they sent out letters indicating we have this inside information about this company. Meanwhile, if you get that letter, first of all, why are you so lucky to get it? Second of all, it's illegal. It's insider trading. But forget about that. Greed takes over. The people, they pumped it up. Eventually, the thing, it crashed. The bad guys had gone off with their money, but this was one case where both the Ukrainian hackers and the American stockbrokers were caught, tried, and convicted. And my favorite part of the trial was there were emails between one of the Ukrainian hackers and a Russian hacker. And the Russian hacker, or the Ukrainian, was saying, why would an American buy stock merely because they get an email from someone telling them that it's good? And the Russian said, Americans buy stock like we drink vodka. So here's the thing: you've got to do your homework. No one likes to do your homework, but that's where you do it. Now with GameStop, what was fascinating to me about this was it was not a pump and dump. In pump and dump, you're lying about this. No one lied. They were very, very transparent. So as far as the people that kind of gathered others online in a chat room to do this, the SEC is investigating, but they're not going to find anything wrong. It just shows a flaw in our system, which always over time will straighten out. And that's what's going to happen there.
I mean, and they were, if I recall correctly, I didn't read extensively on this, is they were just trying to stick it to the man, in quotes.
Yes,
exactly. And that is that a large entity would have to buy a large entity would have to buy. They made a deal where they would have to buy a lot of GameStop stock.
Very good.
at a certain time. And so if we drive up the price, then they have to buy it, and we're going to make lots of money, and they're going to lose.
Yeah, and that's entirely it. And here by the man, it was major hedge funds. And the major hedge funds actually made what should have been, in a normal world, a reasonable decision. GameStop doesn't seem like a good company. And, it sells video game cartridges in the mall. People don't buy video game cartridges in the mall. And so the company was not doing well. So they shorted the stock. Shorting the stock is where you're going to make money when the price of the stock goes down. So they stood to do just fine. However, as you indicated, what happens if you're shorting a stock and it goes up, you not only lose money, but you have to put in more money to cover your investment. And so they did stick it to these hedge funds. But it also, it brings me to something where, and here's where, unfortunately, some of the people who were trying to make some money by being a part of this against the hedge funds, instead of buying the stock themselves, they bought options. And I believe in investing. I think investing in stock in companies is terrific. You put money into companies, the companies grow. But you have things like day trading. Day trading is not investing. Day trading is gambling that today it's going to go up. It doesn't do anything for companies. And shorting is betting that it's going to go down. There's a whole wide variety of investments called derivatives, and they're legal, but they're not. To me, they're not investments. You are betting that something is going to happen. You can bet on the weather through a derivative. And that's what is being exposed today with social media and tech, how vulnerable those derivatives, short selling, and things like that can be when it comes to stock prices. If you're investing in GameStop, that's fine. If it goes up, if it goes down, it's not going to be that crazy. But it's when you start getting into betting whether it's going to go down with a shorting that people can get into trouble. So, not everything that's unethical, illegal, immoral, and fattening is illegal.
So that's a great conclusion to that. Yeah, watching that from the outside was very interesting to witness.
Yeah, it is funny because I was discussing this in my white-collar crime class with my students at Bentley University. And I got to admit, there were a point where I said, am I tempted? This goes against everything I believe in. But was I tempted to go in and out? And I said, no, it was a combination of God would punish me. You think you're so good? Tomorrow, I'm going to hit it on that day. There's no too quick a time, and I decided to stick with my ethics and not be part of that crowd.
That's a good thing. So let's kind of recap the Ponzi scheme. What is it that people should be watching out for? What are the warning signs of the Ponzi scheme?
And what you look at are two ends of the Ponzi scheme. So you look at one of the things, when people invest, they're looking for a return. And so is someone giving you a incredible return? Right away.
Can you define what an incredible return is? Because some people might say, well, 10% is an incredible return if it's on a CD, but if it's on something else, 10% might be a bad return. So how do we define what should ring bells for people?
And, and it's interesting because a 10% is always kind of a good starting point when you're looking at. It does depend on the instrument. And you mentioned that because when you're talking about, Alan Saunders in Texas, his was on CDs and annuities, which don't generally pay a lot. So with that, a 15%, that's ridiculous. So you want to look at the type of investment historically. How does that compare to other of that ilk? And it can be a stock, it can be real estate, whatever. You want to look historically. And if you don't know historically what an investment should return, then you don't know enough about that type of investment and you shouldn't invest in it. So Is it something that is an unusual high return? And then you want to look at the history of this person and their investment and the particular investment. And with Bernie Madoff, the key was it never went down. He never lost. And that, too, is impossible. Marco Polo's the guy that was investigating him. He said, I remember seeing him interviewed on 60 Minutes. They said, well, couldn't he just be good? And he said, no, that's like somebody batting 970 in baseball. It isn't going to happen. So you look at the returns, the rate of returns, and then you look at the person who's in doing the investment. What's their history, their credentials? Unfortunately, there have been so many instances where we've seen scammers that become brokers or hold themselves out as brokers, and they're not even licensed. If you went onto the FINRA website or your state websites for registering of securities dealers, is your guy listed? If he's not listed, that's a problem. If he is listed, you can find out if there are issues. Then you look at who else is going to be there to protect your interests? Is there an independent custodian, a broker-dealer who is holding these things? So if you look at all of these and you're prudent and you don't let your emotion get in the way. I hate to bring gender into it, but I'm going to bring gender into it against our gender. Women become victims of Ponzi schemes many fewer times than men do. Men invest more emotionally than women do, and women do much better because of that.
That is great. If people want to learn more about you, your classes, if they can even participate, and particularly your website, how do they do that?
Best place to go is scamicide.com. It's SCAMICIDE.com. You can sign up there, and it's free for the scam of the day. When I first started it, I wondered if I'd be able to come up with a unique scam of the day. We're up to 3,200 now. Oh. And so you can also go in there if you have a question about how to freeze your credit, how to protect yourself from a SIM swapping. All of these things are there, and you can also find information about my books if you're interested.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Steve.
Always my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Easy Prey podcast. If you found this episode helpful, please leave a review at easyprey.com/review. Notes and a transcript of this episode with Steve Weisman can be found at easyprey.com/53.